On the night of the 3rd of March 3019, the Battle of the Hornburg, also known as Helm's Deep, the battle that would decide the fate of Rohan, began. But it wasn't really through military might that Saruman had backed King Theoden into a corner. In fact, it was mostly due to the vile talents of one man, Grima Wormtongue. Without Grima, Isengard probably never would have stood a chance against Rohan. So in this video, I'm going to talk about just how important Grima Wormtongue was to Isengard's war effort. In 2953, Saruman fortified Isengard and cut himself off from the rest of the outside world. Although it wasn't known at the time, he had officially gone into business for himself. One way or another, he was going to become the Lord of Middle-earth. But there was a small problem. Although Saruman himself was powerful and Isengard was defensible, if Saruman wanted to become the dominant power, he would have to deal with the established powers around him first. Rohan, Gondor, and of course Sauron himself. None of that would be possible without an army. Now, Saruman wasn't entirely without manpower. He appears to have had significant influence over the Dunlendings already around this time, but the Dunlendings were a middling power in the grand scheme of things. Ferocious fighters, sure, but also poorly equipped and not overly numerous. Saruman was not going to conquer with an army of Dunlendings. So around the year 2990, Saruman started breeding orcs, which included the more capable half-orcs and Uruk-hai. But unlike in the films, orcs don't spawn from the ground. An army takes time to breed and equip, and Saruman was fast running out of time. Time until what exactly? Well, that would be Isengard's inevitable confrontation with Rohan. In the lead up to the War of the Ring, Rohan was in a relatively prosperous period. Theoden's reign was mostly peaceful. In the time of Theoden's great-grandfather, Folkwyne, Rohan could muster around 12,000 fully armed riders. In the time of Theoden, that number had probably grown. On top of that, Theoden was a talented commander himself, but so were his subordinates, Theodred, Eomer, Erkenbrand, Grimbold, and Elfhelm to name the most important. So nearing the War of the Ring, Saruman had amassed himself a decent army, probably near to 15,000 if you account for everything. This included the well-armed and well-disciplined Uruk-hai and half-orcs. There were also wolf riders and the ferocious Dunlendings, who even had some horsemen of their own. But if this army was to conquer Rohan, it would have to defeat the Rohirrim in open battle on the grassy fields of Rohan, which of course was a perfect place for cavalry. Perhaps if Saruman had tens of thousands of more soldiers he could risk this, but he didn't. He had one chance, and if this army was obliterated on the plains, that one chance would be gone. So there needed to be a way to weaken Rohan without recklessly throwing away the lives of his own soldiers, and Saruman found it through Grima Wormtongue. We don't know a huge amount about Grima. He was from Rohan, son of a man named Galmod, who Gandalf seemingly knew, which might imply that Grima was from an important family. We don't know when he was bought by Saruman or when he started advising King Theoden, but we know that both had occurred by 3014. We know this because this is when Theoden's health began to fail. At the time, it was reasoned that it could have been due to natural causes. Theoden was 66 after all. But eventually, it became clear to many that Grima had something to do with it, whether through Saruman's spells or through poison. The reason for this was to weaken the judgment of King Theoden, forcing him to rely on Grima, and therefore weaken Rohan's military's ability to coordinate. You see, Theoden had unwittingly left a hole in Rohan's command structure. He had come to the throne young, and like I said earlier, his reign was largely peaceful, so Theoden himself had occupied the position of First Marshal of the Riddermark, while the second and third marshals, Prince Theodred and Eomer respectively, were based out of different areas depending on the threat to Rohan. The first marshal was always in charge of the muster of Edoras and the surrounding lands. But with Theoden incapacitated, it meant that a muster of Edoras and the king's lands could not occur unless someone defied orders, and this is when Rohan's loyalty to Theoden acted as a double-edged sword. They continued to follow his orders even though they were A, bad for Rohan, and B, clearly from Grima Wormtongue. So Grima's advice ensured that Rohan would not be able to muster its full military might against an invasion from Isengard. But there were still capable men in Rohan, and this is where Grima also wildly succeeded, fostering distrust amongst Theoden and his subordinates. Now, Theoden was well loved, so Grima wasn't able to turn Theoden's subjects against him, nor was he able to turn Theoden against Theodred, but he was able to turn Theoden against Eomer. He did this by convincing Theoden that Eomer was disloyal and ambitious, and most importantly, that he wanted to supplant Theodred and become heir to the throne of Rohan. Obviously, none of this was true. The effects of Grima's handiwork were put on display in February 3019. It was clear that Isengard was gearing up for war, so Theoden, the second Marshal, rallied what soldiers he could at the Fords of Isen, numbering around 2,000, a far cry from Rohan's total strength, which should be above 12,000. With Theoden incapacitated and Eomer out of favour, Isengard's battle plan was simple. Kill Theoden because he's the only one standing in Isengard's way. This plan was a success, and Theoden was killed in the first battle of the Fords of Isen on the 25th of February. The only reason the battle wasn't a complete catastrophe for Rohan was because Elfhelm, the commander of Edoras, had defied Theoden's orders and led around 500 riders to the fords. They arrived just in time to save Grimbold and the remainder of Theoden's soldiers. Theoden's final words were, "Let me lie here, to keep the fords until Eomer comes," but when a messenger from the fords arrived at Edoras begging for reinforcements, Eomer had already left to hunt the orcs that had attacked the Fellowship at Amon Hen, and as usual, Grima convinced Theoden to deny the request for reinforcements, stating that it would be unwise to leave Edoras undefended, and to make matters worse, when Eomer returned to Edoras on the 1st of March, he was imprisoned for defying Theoden's orders and hunting the orcs. So on the 1st of March, it's safe to say that Rohan was in extremely dire circumstances, and a lot of that was thanks to Grima Wormtongue. He had incapacitated Theoden and Rohan's central command structure, meaning that Theoden was forced to defend Rohan alone and with far less soldiers than he needed, which resulted in his death. And he had successfully painted Eomer as disloyal, meaning that Eomer was not there to help Theoden, and that he was unable to reinforce the Fords of Isen after Theoden's death because he was imprisoned. With all three of Rohan's top military commanders out of action, it meant that the defense of Rohan was being led by local commanders such as Grimbold and Elfhelm, and they were waiting for reinforcements at the Fords of Isen, reinforcements that would never come. But Saruman didn't capitalize on the success of Grima and the success of his troops at the Fords of Isen. If he launched a full-scale assault immediately afterwards, Rohan would have been defenseless, but instead, Saruman waited. The exact reason is unknown. He might have been cautious and was waiting for Eomer to be removed from the picture first, or he was waiting for his orcs to return with the One Ring. The latter never happened, and Eomer wasn't imprisoned until the first on account of being absent for 5 days. So Saruman launched his invasion of Rohan a full week after the first battle of the Fords of Isen. And that hesitation cost him. On the 2nd of March, even as Saruman's troops were nearing the fords, Gandalf and company had already arrived at Edoras. Grima's treachery was revealed, Theoden was cured of his ailments, and within hours, 1,000 new riders had been gathered to immediately ride west to defend Rohan. Although Theoden was unable to reach the fords in time, he did make it to Helm's Deep, doubling the size of the garrison, and there, after a hard-fought battle, Saruman's army was pushed back and then obliterated when Gandalf and Erkenbrand arrived with 1,000 more men. But things had already gone poorly for Saruman back at home. The previous night, the Ents had destroyed Isengard. Saruman's treatment of Grima following these events was nothing short of awful, and by the end, Grima had become a wretched creature, not too dissimilar to Gollum. I'm not going to say that Grima deserved pity, but what I think he did deserve, at least from Saruman, was credit. Yes, Grima was using the tools that Saruman had given him, but he had succeeded in the difficult task that had also been given to him. He had paralysed Rohan from within, and the kingdom was ready to be handed to Saruman on a plate, but Saruman screwed up on his end, waiting too long to attack. And as for Grima, he was only undone by the intervention of a wizard who had been dead merely 2 weeks earlier. A lasting legacy of Grima's work was the complete reordering of Rohan's military command by Eomer after the War of the Ring. The Marshals of the Riddermark were replaced by the Marshal of the Eastmark and the Marshal of the Westmark, with neither command having precedence over the other. The first Marshal was replaced by the Underking, either the heir or another man. The Underking would rule if the king was absent, sick, or too old, and would lead in the field if the king stayed home. This ensured that a situation like the one with Theoden could never happen again. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. Grima gets a bad reputation. Well, actually, he deserves a bad reputation because he was an awful guy, but he was also incredibly good at being a traitor, I guess. He was incredibly effective at his work, and without him, Saruman's army probably never would have made it to Helm's Deep in the first place. Anyways, cheers, farewell, and remember, if a guy's name is Wormtongue, you should really reconsider letting him be your advisor. I mean, come on, that should be obvious.